It is November of 1864. William Tecumseh Sherman, restless and vigilant, watches as the railroad depot illuminates what little is left of the Atlanta skyline. After a costly siege for the city had been won in September, Sherman was gathering all the supplies he could to move onward to Savannah, splitting Georgia and thereby the Confederacy in two. To aid in this, the Union Army had to vacate Atlanta, stripping it of any military worth. For Atlanta's people, it was a devastating loss. For Sherman, it was just the beginning. As the American Civil War entered its fourth year, the Union's high command was becoming increasingly desperate to end the conflict. A grinding stalemate between Generals Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee in Virginia made prolonging the war unpopular, and the November elections loomed on the horizon. Amid this backdrop, the Atlanta campaign of Brigadier General William Tecumseh Sherman would take place, culminating in the Battle of Jonesboro, where Confederate railway supply lines to Atlanta were cut, leading to Confederate Lieutenant General John Bell Hood evacuating the city and destroying rail cars full of ammunition in his trail. The Union occupation of Atlanta began on September 2nd, just 2 months before the presidential election, providing Abraham Lincoln a much-needed win. The newly promoted Major General Sherman set up his headquarters in the city, and the few remaining civilians were ordered to evacuate. Hoping to divert Union attention away from Georgia, the scattered Confederates coalesced around Hood to harass supply lines leading to Atlanta and wreak havoc in Tennessee. After multiple false starts in pursuing the runaway Hood and contention with his superiors on what to do next, Sherman sent a communication to Lincoln and Grant, detailing his plans and requesting permission to proceed, stating, "I propose we break up the road from Chattanooga and strike out with wagons for Milledgeville, Millen, and Savannah. Until we can repopulate Georgia, it is useless to occupy, but utter destruction of its roads, houses, and people will cripple their military resources. I can make the march and make Georgia howl." After much deliberation, on November 2nd, Grant simply wrote back, "Go as you propose." Easy access to information is a huge asset to any leader looking to accomplish great things. That's why I'd like to recommend the sponsor of today's video, Opera, a web browser that's faster, safer, and smarter than default browsers, and fully featured for privacy, security, and everything you do online. Opera improves my productivity and makes internet surfing easier and more efficient by incorporating a dynamic interface and functionality that adapts to my browsing, providing more space, easier navigation, and smoother interaction. Doing historical research for videos like this is challenging, especially when I have dozens of tabs on different topics open on my browser at once. Opera's Tab Islands offers a simple way to keep my browsing sessions separate without overwhelming me with tabs, making it easy for me to quickly find the information that I need. I can browse with separate dedicated tab islands, collapse or expand islands in one click to hide content and make space, and switch between islands to stay focused on my work. Another nice feature that I enjoy is Aria, Opera's free unlimited native AI, which can explain, explore, or translate any text that you highlight on a page. Opera also includes music players like Spotify, Apple Music, and Tidal, as well as fully integrated messenger platforms like Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, Telegram, and more. Support our channel by clicking the link in the description below, download Opera for free, and experience the most efficient, dynamic, and intuitive web browser available. On the 11th, 3 days after Lincoln's re-election, Union soldiers started tearing up Atlanta's rail lines. By the 15th, Sherman's army prepared to make its fateful 225-mile march to the coastal city of Savannah. But first, he ordered all of Atlanta's industrial and commercial capacity destroyed, sparing only the city's churches and private homes. Despite this, many residential areas were caught up in the fires. By the time his army departed on the morning of the 16th, nearly 40% of the city was destroyed. With the major generals Henry Slocum at his left flank and Oliver Howard at his right, Sherman marched southeast toward Macon. Sherman's army, comprising 62,000 men, was predominantly infantry. Alongside this, there was a 5,000-strong cavalry division and 2,000 artillerymen equipped with 64 guns. Having obliterated their only supply route, these soldiers were now reliant on the resources of the Georgia countryside for sustenance throughout the entire 225-mile march. Foraging units were dispatched to villages along their route to gather as much food as they could, with specific instructions to avoid burglarizing civilian homes. They were directed to focus on acquiring supplies from wealthier residents. In reality, these foragers saw nothing more than free real estate. In addition to the seizing of livestock, meat, and grains, Union foragers ransacked homes for valuables. Clothing, jewelry, wigs, anything that could be sold or shown off was pilfered. Some Southern families opted to bury their possessions, often for their slaves to lead soldiers to them. Confederate defenses against Union pillagers were meager at best. Led by Lieutenant General William Hardee, a garrison of a few thousand militia at Macon gathered to meet Howard's Union forces, only to see their movements turn and head east of the town. It was a feint, and Hardee caught on quickly that Sherman was making his target ambiguous. Beyond this ragtag force at Macon, there were also roving gangs of cavalry, led by Major General Joseph Wheeler. These units were most effective at catching foragers in the act, and distributed summary executions to any captured Yankees. As Howard continued his feint around Macon, one of his accompanying cavalry regiments was ambushed by Wheelers, and then lured into a trap as they gave chase. 3 brigades of the Georgia militia were making their way through Griswoldville, just a couple miles east of Macon, where Wheeler's cavalry would leave their Union pursuers to deal with. While this skirmish did distract parts of Howard's column, superior Federal numbers quickly overwhelmed the defenders, causing the Georgia militia to suffer disproportionate casualties. As the mounted foragers passed by the richer parts of northern Georgia, they took the initiative not only to ruin plantation property, but to free the slaves who worked on such property. To the average Southern aristocrat, those damned Yankees were marauders and thieves. For the men, women, and children held in bondage, they represented an opportunity for freedom. The newly liberated slaves flocked to Union soldiers and followed them on their march, eventually numbering in the thousands. While a morally good deed, accommodating such a large group of people off of rations and foraging became a challenge, one that many of the officers on the march had opposing solutions to, one of which eventually ended in disaster. On the 23rd, Slocum's wing entered the state capital of Milledgeville, with the governor and state government fleeing. There, in the Capitol building, federal forces held a mock vote to repeal Georgia's secession to the Union. After seizing the political heart of Georgia without a shot being fired, Sherman decided to increase federal pressure against the Confederacy. In addition to more time for foraging, federal troops were given more free rein to target any infrastructure that could aid the South. Cotton gins, mills, and other centers of manufacturing were burned, shelled, or rammed. Even the mansion and personal plantation of former Governor Howell Cobbs was put to the torch, save for the slaves' quarters. In addition, hundreds of miles of rail line were slowly and meticulously uprooted by federal forces, often with soldiers working in shifts using crowbars as they twisted lines into shapes that were often impossible to repair. As the columns began to close in on Savannah, Sherman's men were being more frequently inundated by Joseph Wheeler's Confederate skirmishers. Fed up with the harassment, Sherman's cavalry commander, Judson Kilpatrick, detached to pursue their base at Waynesboro. As Union cavalry broke through defensive lines and cut off Confederate access to Augusta, Wheeler was forced to withdraw from the town, severely diminishing his capacity to slow Sherman's onslaught. As the march progressed, the terrain began to change as Union troops entered the low coastal plains of Georgia. Its low elevation was rich in swamplands and marshes, but not so much in plunder and forage, adding further pressure as more fugitive slaves followed the army. On the night of December 8th, one of Sherman's subordinates, Brigadier General Jefferson C. Davis, reached Ebenezer Creek, some 20 miles north of Savannah, where Army engineers prepared a pontoon bridge to allow safe passage. In what is probably the worst atrocity committed on the march, Davis ordered his 14,000 men to cross the bridge over the next few hours, and at the last moment ordered the bridge to be cut and pulled back ashore, preventing the 600 fugitive slaves from crossing, effectively abandoning them on the west side of the creek, their fates left to the incoming Confederate cavalry. Many of these freedmen tried to swim across the icy water for safety, some of whom were aided by disparate Union soldiers, but many more were killed or captured by Wheeler's men. Many of Davis's men objected to this decision, some quite fervently, including Major James Connolly, writing, "The idea of 500 or 600 black women, children, and old men being returned to slavery by such an infernal copperhead as Jeff C. Davis was entirely too much. I told his staff officers of what I thought of such an inhumane, barbarous proceeding." Despite complaints making it all the way up to Sherman, the culpable Brigadier General Davis kept his position due to the lack of experienced field commanders. However, such an act could not stand to be repeated, Sherman thought, and must be reconciled. This event would be the precipice for Special Field Order No. 15, an order made by Sherman to provide arable land for the now liberated slaves and their families. Considerably less compassionate was Sherman's solution to the use of enemy anti-personnel mines. Called torpedoes at the time, Sherman's men began encountering these devices as they approached within the final few miles to Savannah, which had a devastating, terrifying impact on Union morale. As his wits' end, and having seen firsthand the treatment of Union POWs by their captors, Sherman ordered Confederate prisoners to clear the minefields by any means necessary, even when they didn't know where these torpedoes were planted. Finally, on December 10th, Sherman's main force reached the outskirts of Savannah, where they encountered Confederate General Hardee. Hardee, with his 10,000 troops entrenched, had established fortifications that halted the advance of Sherman's main column. Now hundreds of miles into their journey, and hoping to get resupplied for a potential siege, Sherman sent a small contingency to take the coastal Fort McAllister, swiping away a small Confederate garrison on the 13th, and finally reaching the sea, thus allowing the US Navy to resupply the beleaguered forces. With a new supply route set up for the first time in over a month, Sherman sent terms to Hardee on the 17th, demanding the surrender of Savannah or face an overwhelming force. Given the impossible decision to either surrender or persist, Hardee chose neither. On the 20th, the Confederate garrison crossed the Savannah River and made its way north, forcing the city's mayor to present Sherman with the keys to the city himself. General Sherman had done the impossible. Without supply or communication from his fellow Northern comrades, entirely under his command, Sherman had brought Georgia to heel. His army paraded through the countryside, virtually unchallenged by Confederate resistance. Emboldened, the now historic figure sought to replicate this strategy up through the Carolinas, with the same commitment to the scorched earth tactics that subdued Georgia. Sherman was set to cut a bloody path all the way to meet Robert E. Lee in his rear flank. In 1865, Sherman would add the burning of Columbia, South Carolina, and the capture of Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston to his long list of accomplishments, in a campaign that would persist until the end of the war. All the while delivering what both his admirers and opponents would call his divine retribution. In total, it's estimated that Sherman's 37-day campaign did over $100 million in damages in 1864, which today is about $1 billion US, with the vast majority of that damage providing little benefit to the marauding army. Over 300 miles of railroad and countless pieces of Southern infrastructure were trashed. Thousands of horses and cattle, as well as millions of pounds of food, were seized. The march effectively isolated General Lee from most of his remaining peers, and allowed Sherman to move north and threaten Lee's Army of Northern Virginia with encirclement. The march hammered in the first nail of the Confederate coffin, culminating in Lee's surrender on April 9, 1865. The reputation of these actions remain debated among historians and history enthusiasts to this day. But to truly get a grasp of the motivations behind the mayhem, one has to look at only the words of Sherman himself. Since the public mind has settled to the conclusion that the institution of slavery was so interwoven in our system that nothing but the interposition of war could have eradicated it, I believe that the war was worth all that it cost in life and treasure.